I just got back from voting, and it was so easy. I just filled out a quick registration form a few weeks ago, went to my local polling place on election day, and filled out my ballot. Voting is such an important responsibility as a citizen, and it really feels great to have my voice heard. But did you know that it wasn't always as easy for every American citizen to cast a vote on election day? For many years, voting was almost impossible for many African Americans. In 1965, a brave group of people found the courage to call attention to this unfairness and demand their right to vote. What led to the civil rights protests in Selma? By 1964, tension was brewing in parts of the United States. People were frustrated over the unfair treatment of African Americans. President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law that year. This law is one of the most important civil rights laws in United States history. It was designed to stop racial discrimination in public places and end the practice of forcing African Americans to use separate schools, water fountains, and other public spaces than white people. During this time, civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. was working hard to end this unfair treatment too. In fact, he won the 1964 Nobel Peace Prize for his nonviolent actions towards achieving social and political equality for all Americans. Although the Civil Rights Act had been passed and Dr. King won the Nobel Prize for his work, many African Americans were still suffering from racial discrimination. This was especially true in the South. In many areas, people who controlled the elections and the registrars of voters were trying to stop African Americans from registering to vote. Sometimes they asked African Americans to fill out long, complicated forms or to take very difficult literacy tests. Some areas even charged a fee for voting. Worst of all, some African Americans were threatened with violence if they tried to register to vote. Dr. King wanted to bring attention to this discrimination. He chose to organize a peaceful demonstration in the small town of Selma, Alabama. Dr. King chose Selma because it had a very low number of African Americans registered to vote. In fact, only 150 out of 15,000 eligible African American voters had completed the voter registration process. Selma had also been the site of a terrible crime. On February 15, 1965, a peaceful protester, Jimmy Lee Jackson, had been shot to death by an Alabama state trooper. Dr. King worked with local civil rights leaders to organize a march that would bring the nation's attention to Selma. A group of peaceful demonstrators would march all the way from Selma, Alabama, to the Alabama State Capitol building in Montgomery. We are learning so much about the history of the civil rights movement in the United States. Let's take a minute to review. Here's question 1. In what year did President Johnson sign the Civil Rights Act? A. 1955, B. 1964, C. 1992, D. 2001. If you answered B, you know that the Civil Rights Act was signed in 1964. Question 2. What award did Martin Luther King Jr. win in 1964? A. Nobel Peace Prize, B. Pulitzer Prize, C. Academy Award, D. President's Award. The correct answer is A. Martin Luther King Jr. won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Let's try question 3. Which of the following was used to keep African Americans from registering to vote? A. Threats of violence, B. Voting fees, C. Literacy tests, D. All of the above. The correct answer is D. Threats, fees, and literacy tests were used to keep African Americans from registering to vote. What were the events of Bloody Sunday? Although he could not attend himself, Dr. King worked with local civil rights leaders to plan the peaceful march. On March 7th, 600 people gathered after Sunday services at Brown Chapel in Selma. The group was led by John Lewis, the leader of a student group committed to nonviolence. Lewis and his marchers were ready to begin their 54-mile journey to Montgomery. It was a cold, raw day and tension filled the air. The march began quietly. As the group began to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were met with police cars blocking their path and more than 200 state troopers lined up. The marchers stayed on the sidewalk and kept calm. The police gave orders for the group to turn around. John Lewis tried to reason with the police, but the troopers gave the group a 2-minute warning to return to their homes or the church from which the march started. Only 1 minute and 5 seconds went by before the state trooper in charge gave orders for the police to go into the crowd. The troopers sprayed the marchers with tear gas and beat them with billy clubs. 50 marchers were badly injured and were sent to the hospital. What the state troopers didn't count on was that all of this violence would be captured and shown on televisions across America. Networks interrupted their regular programs to broadcast the event, and many Americans were outraged at the violence they saw. This first march became known as Bloody Sunday. Let's take a minute to review what we have learned about what happened in Selma, Alabama in 1965. Question 1. How many people joined the protest on March 7th, 1965? A. 100. B. 300. C. 600. Or D. More than 1,000 people? If you answered C, you know that 600 people gathered to protest on March 7th, 1965. Here's question 2. What was the nickname given to the violent events of March 7th, 1965? A. Tough March. B. Alabama Riot. C. Discrimination Weekend. D. Bloody Sunday. The correct answer is D. The events of March 7th, 1965 are known as Bloody Sunday. Let's try question 3. How many miles is the journey from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama? A. 17 miles. B. 24 miles. C. 30 miles. D. 54 miles. If you answered D, you know that it is 54 miles from Selma to Montgomery. What did Martin Luther King Jr. do after Bloody Sunday? Martin Luther King Jr. and many other Americans were outraged at the violence endured by the peaceful protesters on Bloody Sunday. They were more determined than ever to make the march from Selma to Montgomery. They wanted the nation to understand that African Americans were not only being denied the right to vote, but were also being denied their right to peacefully protest. Dr. King knew that the Alabama governor, George Wallace, did not want the group to be able to make the march. Dr. King told local officials that the group was going to try again as a symbol of their determination. He stressed that they would be nonviolent and would turn around on the bridge if the state troopers tried to stop them. 2 days after Bloody Sunday, on March 9, 1965, Dr. King arrived in Selma to lead a group on the symbolic march. The group got to the top of the bridge and were again met by a wall of state police. Dr. King asked the troopers to allow the group a minute to pray. After the prayer, the group turned around and returned to Brown Chapel. Meanwhile, Dr. King had been working with President Johnson on a plan that would allow the marchers to make their trek to Montgomery. The U.S. Justice Department filed a lawsuit asking for an order to force the state of Alabama to stop punishing people involved in nonviolent civil rights protests. On March 17, 1965, a federal judge agreed with the Justice Department. So, Dr. King and other civil rights leaders began organizing and speaking with local leaders in Selma to work out a way to successfully complete the March to Montgomery. We are learning about how Dr. King brought attention to the problem of racial discrimination. Let's review what we know. Question 1. What did Dr. King ask the marchers to do once they reached the top of the bridge that was blocked by police? A. Yell and shout. B. Run away. C. Charge at the police. D. Pray. The correct answer is D. Dr. King asked the marchers to pray. Here's question 2. Who helped Dr. King create a plan to successfully complete the march from Selma to Montgomery? A. President Johnson. B. Governor Wallace. C. Vice President Hubert Humphrey. D. None of the above. If you answered A, you know that President Johnson worked with Dr. King to create a plan. Question 3. Which government agency filed a lawsuit to stop Alabama State Police from punishing nonviolent protesters? A. The FBI. B. The Supreme Court. C. The Department of Education. D. The Justice Department. The correct answer is D. The Justice Department filed the lawsuit. What were the events of the official march from Selma to Montgomery on March 21, 1965? As you can see, for many African Americans of the 1960s, voting wasn't as easy as it was for me today. Dr. King and President Johnson were determined to work out a plan so that protesters could have their voices heard by marching all the way from Selma to Montgomery. They came up with a plan that included a third try scheduled for March 21, 1965. This time, the march would be different. President Johnson had agreed to use the Alabama National Guard and the U.S. Army to provide protection to the protesters. Alabama's Governor George Wallace was not happy with the president's plan, but agreed to let the march go forward. People came to Selma from all over the United States to join the march. They were angry at what they had seen on television a few weeks earlier and wanted to show their support. More than 3,000 marchers were led by Dr. King on their journey to Montgomery. The streets along the route were lined with National Guardsmen to protect the protesters who walked about 12 miles each day and slept in fields at night. Church and student groups provided food, water, and other services to the group. By the time they reached the state capitol in Montgomery, the group of marchers had grown to more than 25,000 people. Dr. King stood on the steps and gave a speech that told of the African American struggle for equal rights and praised the white people who had faced danger to join the march. During his speech, Dr. King proclaimed, "The end we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience. And that will be a day not of the white man, not of the black man. That will be the day of man as man." What courage it must have taken for Dr. King and the others to march to Montgomery. Let's review what we know about the famous journey. Here's question 1. How many people began the march to Montgomery on March 21, 1965? A. Fewer than 200. B. 500. C. 1,000. D. More than 3,000. The correct answer is D. More than 3,000 people began the march to Montgomery. Question 2. Who provided protection for the marchers? A. The National Guard. B. State troopers. C. The Coast Guard. D. Student groups. If you answered A, you know that the National Guard provided protection. Here's question 3. Where did the marchers sleep each night? A. In fields. B. In hotels. C. In volunteers' houses. D. In churches. The correct answer is A. The marchers slept in fields. What were the effects of the march from Selma to Montgomery in 1965? The march to Montgomery and the words of Dr. King brought positive change to the United States. While the protesters were marching, President Johnson met with Congress and called for a new law to protect the voting rights of African Americans. The president wanted Congress to pass a law that would ban the use of literacy tests and fees for voting. Congress agreed, and 5 months later passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Once this law was passed, many more African American people registered to vote. The good news is that number continues to rise. Another great effect of Dr. King and his civil rights work is that there are more African American lawmakers in the South. Before in 1964, there weren't any African American lawmakers in the southern states. By 1992, there were more than 350. Remember John Lewis, the student leader who was badly beaten on Bloody Sunday? He is now a member of Congress and has been proudly representing the state of Georgia for almost 30 years. The march from Selma to Montgomery raised awareness about racial discrimination in the United States and showed the power of nonviolent demonstrations. Thinking question: why is the ability to vote so powerful?